Consistently 7 days. Message, language, genre, and interpretive history concerning Yom. Biblical message. The message of the Bible presents support for the days of Genesis 1-2 being 7 literal days, and no support for the days of creation and the day of rest following being non-literal, although the initial day of rest foreshadowed spiritual rest. God considered his finished creation good, rested from having made it, and sanctified the 7th day in which he rested. There's a pleased refraining from activity that would not make anything perfect better, apart from any mention of the exhaustion we humans know so well. Death entered the world by human sin. Death will be the last enemy destroyed. Because God called his work good before humans sinned, death is not a part of the creative process. Christ also referred to the Genesis account of creation as historically accurate in such passages as Matthew 19:4-6 and Mark 10:6-9. Believing God used death and evolution to produce humans is contradictory to these verses, and precluding our sin as the source of death, to believe logically cohesive with believing that Christ came to pay our death penalty. The very verbs in Genesis 2:2-3 indicate the days to be literal. Many indicate past tense, completed action: finished, had, rested, made, and had done. Exodus 20:11 confirms the past tense rested. It does not refer to an ongoing action. God himself twice wrote out mention of having finished creation on the 6th day and having rested on the 7th day. Sometimes other biblical mentions of the word rest are taken out of context. In John 5:17, Jesus refers to the continuing redemptive and providential work of God. God's rest, mentioned on Genesis 2:2, pertains to completing the creation of the universe. One argument using Scripture to try to support old earth creation, including a non-literal creation work week, involves reiterating that with the Lord, 1 day is as 1,000 years. But this is taken out of the context of the rest of the verse, and 1,000 years is 1 day. Looking for evidence that the days of creation were not literal, sometimes people make assumptions that are not based on sound exegesis. For example, Adam's comment at meeting Eve, hapa'am, could be spoken of a few days' unmet longing. Translating this phrase as at last rather than this time, its usual meaning being time, and this time, when is here accompanied by the definite article, makes less sense in the context, as God said in Genesis 2:18 that it wasn't good for man to be alone. God allows what is not good, and thus not in accordance with his attribute of being good, for his purposes, but did not introduce evil into creation, only allowing temporary incompleteness through using time. He built the choice into humans, persons in his image, and has more quickly confirmed the choice in angels, also made his servants and so persons. There isn't personhood apart from some choice whether or not to reject other people, including even our Creator. Interpretative history. The few church fathers who taught a creation time frame different from 6 days taught that God did not take 6 days. Their allegorical approach was based on thinking that because God was outside of time, his creation account referred to his activities but not human time, as if God would refer to his creative time out of context of the people he mainly made it to help house. Even during Luther's lifetime in the 1600s, throughout Christendom, the prevalent dissension continued to be believing that God did not take as long as 6 days to create the universe. Luther challenged these views, including the belief that God only took 1 day or created the universe instantaneously, as unscriptural. Genre, consistent throughout the genres of biblical narrative, prophecy, legal writings, wisdom literature, and poetry. When Yom is modified by a cardinal or ordinal number, it always refers to a day of around 24 hours in duration, or the daylight period of such a day. Hebrew and English language issues. Narrative texts are typified by preterite verbs, which describe a past condition, action, or state that has been completed. In the Bible, the preterite verb type is uncommon in passages of the poetic genre, but characteristic of historical narrative. In fact, poetic passages can be distinguished from historical by the ratio of preterite verbs. The possible meanings for a word are called its semantic range. Among the forms, singular, dual, and plural, of the 2,300 Old Testament occurrences of Yom, there are only 5 possible meanings: about 24 hours, daylight, general or vague time, specific time, and year. When Yom is used in describing a time period other than literal days or daylight, other indicators of time, such as the words for month or year, heavily modify it. The normal meaning of both Yom and day is about 24 hours. Aside from Genesis 1, the words for evening and morning are combined with Yom 19 times. This combination always denotes that particular portion of a 24-ish hour day. The word for evening, occurring with morning, but not with Yom, has 38 instances outside of Genesis 1, and also always denotes a 24-ish hour day. In addition, nowhere does Yom occurring with evening or morning denote any amount of time possibly longer than a day. The references to days in Genesis 1, with both evening and morning, are more obviously referring to literal days by the presence of these qualifiers. If Earth's rotation has slowed since God created the universe, days then would have been shorter than our current days of about 23 hours and 56 minutes. We reference about 24 hours to convey more plainly the day and night cycles whose duration now and probably then has been slightly less than 24 hours. Likewise, night has a very static meaning. In the Old Testament, besides those occurrences in Genesis 1, Yom occurs 53 times in combination with Leil or Layla, night. Regardless of context differences, historical, prophetic, or poetic, this combination always means night, Yom being used to distinguish the night as the distinct part of the day. Dr. Andrew Steinman noted several aspects of the wording in Genesis 1 through 2, verse 3 that make the literal nature of the mentioned days especially clear. In Genesis 1, verse 5, day is defined as the daylight period and then as the day and night cycle. The Hebrew text doesn't include definite articles, which for days 1 through 5 indicates one day, a second day, and so on. Yom unexpectedly not having an article concerning the next 2 days, 6th, 7th day instead of a 6th, 7th day, indicates that these days were also solar days but special, the culmination day of the week of creation, and the day God set apart for rest. Dr. Robert McCabe has pointed out that the construct noun of Genesis 2:4 and the absolute noun of Genesis 1 have meanings distinct from each other, with differing grammatical context. Genesis 2 verse 4 is in the context of when. In order to presume the days of Genesis 1 as longer than literal days with day and night cycles, some assume day in Genesis 2:4 to be separable from an idiomatic complex construct, which goes against rules of Hebrew grammar. In reference to God's creation of the universe, the Genesis 2 verse 4 mention of day occurs in the compound construction in the day of making, originally 3 words in Hebrew, in as inseparable preposition, the construct day in the singular, and the infinitive construct making. The format, preposition in prefixed to construct noun day, followed by a construct that is infinitive, in an idiomatic construction of a temporal nature, as shown in its over 60 Old Testament occurrences. Of these, references to particular days can be translated on the day when, and more general temporal references can be translated as when. The Genesis 2 verse 4 reference to "in the day of" thus matches "when" as far as meaning, and does not cast a shadow on the veracity of the days described in Genesis 1 being literal. Sometimes the non-literal creation week argument includes trying to use God's reference to the result of sin as an example of a reference to a day as non-literal. Yet in Genesis 2:17, part of God's warning Adam and Eve to not eat that one kind of fruit could also be translated as "when." Often rendered "in the day," this phrase in the warning indicates dying as a result rather than immediately. Also, what physical death compares with spiritual death? Even the textual basis of the week hinges on the days of creation week being literal. In Exodus 20:11 and 31 verse 17, the 4 in the account denotes causation. The purport is that God established the work week by his resting on the seventh day. Assumptions concerning the basis of the week being unconnected with the assumed non-literal days of creation are invalid. Leviticus 25 verses 3-4 cannot be logically used to support the days of creation not being literal days. It is referring specifically to years, not lengthy or indefinite amounts of time, and not days. Also, "key," which indicates causation, is absent from Leviticus 25, verses 3-4. Cardinal and ordinal numbers used with yom also support the interpretation of the days of Genesis 1-2, verse 3 being literal. Yom in the plural, combined with a cardinal number, such as 1 or 3, has the meaning of a specific time duration, and there are 189 instances of this construction. 162 times the use of the preposition "for" or "on" with yom, usually in the singular and in conjunction with an ordinal number, such as first or third, denotes action taking place on a specific yom. The construction of Genesis 1 functions somewhat like the preposition in this pattern. Semitic and Hebrew idiom also needs to be looked into when gaining an understanding of the days of creation. One out-of-context claimed support of a non-literal approach to the account in Genesis 1-2 is a form of Semitic poetic parallelism. This Semitic literary device involves a whole number followed by the next whole number in referring to one thing or type of thing in different ways, rather than referring to literal, unique numbered things. In support of alleged non-literal days, some have referenced another Hebraic idiom used in describing days, but do so out of context. The Jewish way of referring to days with synecdoche included partial days. After 3 days and until the third day, in Matthew 27, verses 63-64, for example, refer to the same amount of time and the same ending time. Tense can also contribute to misunderstanding Genesis 1-2. Some people believe that Genesis 2:19 contradicts Genesis 1 and consider this proof of Genesis not being chronological. Some English translations indicate in Genesis 2:19 that God made birds after he made Adam, which is backwards from the order of creation described in Genesis 1. The tense of Hebrew verbs is based on context. When there is more than one possible translation, the one not contradicting the rest of the text should be used. In Genesis 2:19, the pluperfect translation is grammatically correct, as well as doing away with the apparent contradiction. God had formed the animals makes sense in the context of the birds being made before Adam was, as described in Genesis 1. Another extremely important factor in understanding the days of creation to have been literal is that there were plenty of other words that could have been used to denote time. There are about 14 possible meanings for the word day in English. Hebrew has about 7 meanings of yom, depending at least partly on context, and several words that can denote time. Besides the general word for time, and besides yom itself, there are 10 other words that could have been used instead of yom, and another word that could have been used in conjunction with yom, to denote time less briefer and of less definite length than a literal day. The possible meanings of these 11 words provided a scope of meaning including forever, always, continually, of old, generation, season, and length of days. All this information is helpful, but not for the sole sake of knowing it. We've examined some important factors in believing the days in Genesis 1 through 2-3 to be literal, and can appreciate a cohesive understanding of the Bible as understandable and meaningful. What do we do with this? There are many people who are not interested in the Bible because they believe it to be inaccurate concerning origins. Understanding and other gifts from God, partly due to their never-decreasing nature, are meant to be shared, not in a judgmental way, but offered as the gifts they are. This understanding of such a substantial and inextricable part of the Bible to be true can help people understand God to be true, and it's in Him alone that real hope can be found.